when an avoidant and an empath both go no contact. This happens next. Curious. Have you ever wondered what happens in the silence after two completely opposite emotional worlds collide and then go completely quiet? When a relationship between an empath, someone wired for deep emotional resonance, tuning into every micro expression and subtle mood shift, and an avoidant, someone whose fundamental coping mechanism is self-reliance and distance, reaches a breaking point, something fascinating occurs. Thoughtful. They both pull back. They both enter no contact. To the outside world, silence looks uniform. It looks empty. It looks like nothing is happening. But beneath the surface of that quiet, two radically different neurological and emotional processes are unfolding at the exact same time. Most people assume that no contact works the same way for everyone. We tell ourselves, if they aren't reaching out, they don't care, or if they're quiet, they must be healing. But attachment theory and emotional intelligence tell us a completely different story. The human brain does not process separation in a vacuum. It processes separation through the lens of early relational wiring. For the empath, silence feels like an open, bleeding wound, an abrupt loss of emotional attunement that triggers immediate anxiety and an intense drive to repair. For the avoidant, silence initially feels like a long overdue exhale, a sudden relief from what their nervous system perceives as overwhelming emotional demand. So, who breaks first? Who actually heals? And why does the emotional atmosphere often flip completely upside down months into the quiet? If you have ever found yourself caught in this cycle, or if you are currently sitting in the heavy silence of a no-contact period, wondering what is happening on the other side of the wall, you need to understand the hidden timeline of this dynamic. Because what happens in stage 3 of this silence is something almost nobody expects, yet it happens with near predictable precision. Stick with me through this entire breakdown, because understanding this dynamic isn't just about knowing what the other person is feeling, it is about gaining complete mastery over your own emotional landscape. Avoidants protect themselves through self-reliance and emotional suppression, while empaths regulate through relational connection and shared processing. Avoidants experience immediate relief and a sense of restored autonomy, while empaths experience acute withdrawal symptoms similar to breaking a physical attachment. As time passes, the empath completes their grief process and begins internal emotional regulation, while the avoidant's suppressed emotions begin to resurface once the perceived threat of intimacy is gone. When the empath stops pursuing, the avoidant loses their familiar anchor of emotional tension, forcing them to face the underlying pain they were running from. The empath emerges with self-directed emotional intelligence, while the avoidant either seeks genuine resolution or retreats further into self-protective patterns. The concept of self-regulation sits at the absolute core of how we navigate emotional stress, yet the way an empath and an avoidant approach this process could not be more divergent. When a relationship enters silence, we are not merely witnessing two people taking a break from communication, we are observing two fundamentally opposite neural and psychological architectures attempting to regain equilibrium. To understand why this silence feels so violent to one person and so comforting to another, we have to look beneath the surface behavior and examine how each individual's nervous system interprets emotional distance. For the empath, emotional regulation is inherently relational. An empath's cognitive and emotional framework is wired to tune deeply into environmental cues, subtle changes in tone, micro-expressions, and shifts in interpersonal energy. When tension arises, their biological instinct is not to retreat, but to move closer, to process, to discuss, and to repair the rupture immediately. In psychological terms, they experience high emotional reactivity combined with an intense drive for co-regulation. When an empath goes into no contact, their internal thermostat goes haywire. The sudden removal of relational feedback triggers the amygdala, sending stress signals throughout the body. Without the ability to check in or receive reassurance, the empath's mind enters a state of dysregulation. They experience acute emotional withdrawal, replaying past interactions and searching for answers, because their brain perceives the loss of connection as an active threat to their emotional safety. On the other end of the spectrum sits the avoidant, whose primary survival strategy is hyper-independence and emotional suppression. Avoidant attachment is not a lack of emotion, but rather a sophisticated defense system designed to protect the individual from the perceived danger of intimacy. Early life experiences often teach the avoidant that relying on others leads to disappointment, engulfment, or loss of control. Consequently, their nervous system learns to regulate through distance, self-reliance, and deactivation. When conflict escalates, the avoidant does not experience a desire to fix the problem. They experience an overwhelming impulse to escape the pressure. When no contact begins, the avoidance system does not go into panic, it goes into hyperregulation. By cutting off emotional input, they successfully suppress the distress response. What looks like cold indifference from the outside is actually a subconscious strategy to maintain internal control and prevent their emotional boundaries from collapsing under the weight of relational demands. This fundamental mismatch creates a profound paradox at the start of no contact. The empath is fighting against a wave of internal chaos, desperately seeking emotional resolution to calm their nervous system, while the avoidant is basking in a sense of restored autonomy, utilizing isolation as a shield against emotional vulnerability. One relies on connection to feel safe, while the other relies on distance to feel secure. This clash between hyperregulation through isolation and dysregulation through abandonment forms the dynamic foundation upon which the rest of the no-contact period unfolds, setting the stage for a dramatic emotional reversal as time moves forward. The immediate aftermath of cutting ties is marked by a dramatic divergence in internal experience, creating a temporal illusion where one person appears to be moving on seamlessly while the other is consumed by emotional paralysis. In the early days and weeks of no contact, the avoidant individual experiences what attachment researchers refer to as deactivation. For someone with an avoidant attachment strategy, relational closeness, especially when marked by unresolved conflict or high emotional intensity, is registered by the nervous system as a form of engulfment. The constant demand for emotional presence, discussion, and vulnerability taxes their psychological bandwidth. When the decision to initiate no contact is made and the line of communication goes dead, the avoidance system registers an immediate release of pressure. The nervous system drops out of a fight-or-flight posture and enters a state of artificial calm. They feel an overwhelming sense of relief, accompanied by a surge of renewed autonomy. They may dive into work, hobbies, fitness, or social activities with heightened energy, genuinely believing that the relationship was the sole source of their distress and that its absence has restored their true self. Conversely, the empath enters an entirely different physiological and psychological state characterized by acute withdrawal. Because the empath relies heavily on co-regulation, the process by which two individuals help stabilize each other's emotional states through presence and attunement, the sudden absolute cutoff acts as a severe shock to their system. The brain's neural circuits for pain and attachment are deeply intertwined, meaning that the loss of connection registers not merely as a sad thought, but as a physical ache. The empath's amygdala remains hyperactive, pumping stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline through the body. This chemical state creates a persistent, intrusive compulsion to fix the rupture, leading to obsessive loop thinking, constant checking of devices, and intense self-doubt. The empath feels a profound sense of abandonment. interpreting the avoidant's quiet exterior as confirmation that the relationship meant nothing to the other person, which further heightens their emotional panic and dysregulation. This initial phase creates a profound disparity in emotional timelines that misleads both parties. The avoidant perceives their own immediate sense of relief as permanent freedom and confirmation that leaving was the correct choice, completely oblivious to the fact that their peace is built on suppression rather than true processing. They have successfully pushed the underlying emotions into the subconscious basement, using the sudden silence as a heavy door to keep those feelings locked away. Meanwhile, the empath is forced to feel the full, raw weight of the grief all at once, experiencing the agonizing collapse of their relational world. What neither realizes during these initial weeks is that this immediate dynamic is entirely temporary. The avoidance relief is a temporary buffer created by the sudden removal of perceived pressure, while the empath's acute panic is the necessary, albeit painful, first step in actively discharging the grief that the avoidant is currently postponing. As the silence stretches into weeks and eventually months, the initial emotional landscape undergoes a quiet yet profound inversion. The dynamic moves past the immediate physiological shock and into the phase where true psychological processing, or the lack thereof, begins to bear fruit. For the empath, sitting in the heavy, unyielding silence eventually forces a fundamental pivot in how they handle emotional pain. Having exhausted their biological distress response through active grieving, crying, and relentless self-reflection, the empath's nervous system slowly exits the state of chronic alarm. The brain's prefrontal cortex gradually re-engages, allowing logic and executive function to balance out the raw emotional chaos of the amygdala. The empath begins the hard work of internal emotional regulation, learning to generate their own sense of safety rather than searching for it in another person's response. They start to process the reality of the relationship with newfound objectivity, recognizing patterns of emotional neglect and boundary erosion that they previously overlooked in their desperate bid for connection. Simultaneously, an entirely different mechanism begins to unfold within the avoidance psychological frame. Defense mechanisms like emotional deactivation and suppression require immense, continuous psychological energy to maintain, even if that energy expenditure occurs below conscious awareness. In the early stage of no contact, the avoidance suppression was sustained by the residual feeling of being pursued or the lingering expectation of an emotional demand. However, as the empath's silence becomes absolute and permanent, the perceived threat of intimacy and engulfment completely vanishes. Without a threat to defend against, the avoidance emotional armor begins to crack. The heavy vault door keeping their suppressed feelings locked away starts to lose its structural integrity. Because suppression merely postpones emotion rather than resolving it, the unprocessed grief, attachment needs, and painful feelings that were buried during the breakup begin to leak into their conscious awareness. This psychological turning point marks the moment where the emotional timelines cross paths. The empath, having met their pain head-on from day one, arrives at a place of genuine integration and emotional sobriety. They no longer feel an addictive pull to check for updates or seek closure, because they have constructed their own closure out of self-awareness and acceptance. In stark contrast, the avoidant finds themselves facing the very emotional wave they spent months trying to outrun. The artificial calm of their early independence dissipates, replaced by an unfamiliar creeping sense of emptiness and emotional disorientation. The space that once felt like a sanctuary of freedom begins to feel like a vacuum of isolation. As the empath completes their cycle of suffering and steps into authentic clarity, the avoidant is just beginning to encounter the delayed, unvarnished weight of the loss. The quiet shift that takes place deeper into the silence is governed by a fundamental law of relational dynamics. Energy always demands balance. During the relationship and even in the early days of separation, the avoidant relies heavily on the empath's emotional pursuit to maintain their own sense of identity and control. Even when the avoidant is retreating, pulling away, or remaining cold, they are doing so in direct response to the empath's forward energy. The empath's longing, anxiety, and visible distress act as an external anchor for the avoidant. It signals to the avoidant's subconscious that the connection is still secure, that they are still valued, and that they possess the ultimate power to choose when or if to draw near. This dynamic creates a comfortable buffer for the avoidant. They can enjoy the psychological safety of knowing they are wanted, while simultaneously keeping the terrifying prospect of true emotional intimacy at bay. When the empath truly lets go and enters genuine, internal no contact, that familiar anchor disappears. This is not the performative silence where the empath is secretly counting days and hoping for a text, but the profound silence of emotional detachment. As the empath reclaims their focus, their energetic investment in the dynamic completely evaporates. Suddenly, the avoidant finds themselves floating in a psychological vacuum. The wall of defense they built so carefully was designed to resist a force pushing against it. When that force stops pushing entirely, the wall loses its purpose and structurally collapses. The avoidant no longer feels the pressure of being pursued, but in its place, they encounter something far more threatening to their defense mechanism: the absolute stillness of their own unbuffered internal world. Without the empath's emotional noise to react against, the avoidant is forced to stand face to face with the very core fears they spent a lifetime avoiding: fears of worthlessness, deep-seated loneliness, and the terrifying realization that their self-reliance might actually be a prison. This unseen shift reshapes the entire architecture of the quiet period. The avoidant begins to realize that the emotional tension they so desperately wanted to escape was actually the only thread keeping them connected to a source of genuine warmth and attunement. The loss of this anchor triggers a subtle, profound destabilization within the avoidant's nervous system. They begin to experience a strange form of disorientation, where the freedom they celebrated earlier starts to feel remarkably like rejection. The mind, stripped of its ability to blame the empath for being too needy or demanding, has no choice but to look inward. The narrative that they were the strong, self-sufficient one begins to dissolve, exposing the reality that their independence was merely a fear-based reaction to intimacy. As the empath builds a solid internal foundation of self-worth and self-soothing, the avoidant's internal foundation begins to fracture under the weight of an unaddressed past, proving that retreating from a connection does not protect you from the pain of losing it. The ultimate resolution of the no-contact period between an empath and an avoidant reveals the profound difference between temporary coping mechanisms and authentic emotional growth. When two people reach the end of this silent trajectory, they do not arrive at the same psychological destination. The outcome is determined entirely by how each individual utilized the silence, whether it was embraced as a catalyst for deep self-reflection or used as a stronghold for ego preservation. For the empath, the journey through the fire of separation yields a fundamental transformation in their emotional intelligence. Having endured the acute agony of withdrawal without running back to the source of their pain, the empath develops robust internal boundaries. They realize that their intense capacity for empathy, while a powerful gift, becomes self-destructive when offered to someone who cannot match it with accountability and safety. They emerge from the experience with a calibrated self-awareness, learning to regulate their own nervous system without relying on external validation. They no longer equate self-sacrifice with love, nor do they mistake emotional volatility for passion. For the avoidant, the long-term outcome splits into two distinct possibilities, both driven by how they choose to process the delayed grief that inevitably arrives. In one scenario, the confrontation with their own internal emptiness serves as a rare, powerful wake-up call. Stripped of their defenses and faced with the permanent loss of a deeply attuned partner, the avoidant may reach a point of profound self-reckoning. They begin to see that their pattern of fleeing intimacy is not a sign of strength, but a fear-based reflex that keeps them perpetually isolated. If they possess sufficient courage, this realization can spark a genuine journey toward healing their underlying attachment wounds, leading them to seek professional help or work actively to tolerate vulnerability. However, in many cases, the avoidant chooses the second path, intensifying their protective armor. To escape the rising tide of regret and unprocessed pain, they double down on their deactivation strategies. They may adopt a bitter narrative that the relationship was doomed anyway, distract themselves with superficial connections, or retreat deeper into hyper-independence, effectively solidifying the very defense mechanisms that guarantee future relational failure. Ultimately, the long-term reality of this dynamic proves that no contact is never truly neutral. It acts as an emotional amplifier, accelerating the empath's path towards self-directed emotional mastery, while stripping the avoidant of the illusions that protected their ego. The empath walks away with a restored sense of self-worth, equipped with the discernment necessary to build healthy, reciprocal relationships in the future. The avoidant is left at a critical crossroad, forced to choose between the uncomfortable pain of growth or the familiar safety of isolation. The silence completes its work, not by dictating whether two people end up together, but by exposing the true depth of each person's emotional maturity, proving that authentic connection can only exist where both individuals are willing to face themselves.